Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for tuning in to today's webinar from Smith School of Business at Queen's University. My name is Julia Lefebvre, and I'm a member of the Smith Business Insight team. I will be your host for today's event. To begin, I want to acknowledge that Queen's is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We are grateful to live, learn, and play on these lands. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar, Turning Strategy into Results. Many organizations struggle to achieve their strategic goals, and today we're going to learn why that is and what you can do to close the gap between strategy and execution so that you can achieve the results you want, which sounds pretty great to me. Now, before we dive in, I do have a bit of housekeeping. First off, we are recording this presentation, and yes, just by being registered today, you will automatically receive a link to the recording in your inbox by this Thursday. Please feel free to share the link among your network. The chat feature will be open today, so you can converse with one another there. We'd love to know where everyone is tuning in from, so feel free to drop that into the chat. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's two presenters. Kathryn Brohman is an associate professor at Smith School of Business and an expert on digital transformation and strategy execution. She is also the director of the Master of Digital Product Management program here at Smith. She has co-authored several books, including Shift, A New Mindset for Sustainable Execution, and has pioneered programs in strategy, execution, and digital transformation across MBA, professional masters, and executive programs. Barry Cross is an assistant professor at Smith School of Business and an expert and thought leader in innovation, execution, and operations strategy. He joined Smith after nearly 20 years in the automotive and manufacturing sectors, where he led many key strategic initiatives, including nearly 30 program launches internationally. He is the best-selling author of 3 books, including Simple, Killing Complexity for a Lean and Agile Organization. Kathryn and Barry, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Thanks, Julia.
Hi, Kathryn. Hi, Barry.
Thanks, Julia.
Now, before I pass it over to you, Kathryn, I just want to mention that we are going to have an opportunity to take some questions after the formal presentations today. And for the audience to please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit those questions at any time during the webinar. This is really a fantastic opportunity to tap into some experts on today's topic. So we ask that you submit those in the Q&A button and not the chat feature where we might miss them. Also, I want to let our audience know that Kathryn and Barry will be teaching on a Queen's Executive Education program called Strategic Execution, which is taking place this fall, November 11th to 15th. So if the ideas and concepts presented today really catch your attention and you want to go deeper, the Strategic Execution program is for you. We'll include a link to the program in our follow-up email, and I think my colleague Rob is going to pop a link into the chat for easy reference as well. So let's get started. Kathryn, as you'll be presenting first, the floor is yours. Barry and I will disappear. Please take it away.
Great, thanks, Julia, and welcome everyone. So Barry and I have been at this for quite some time. Some of you that are joining us might have seen us together. We have a couple programs that we do together. This one was the latter of the two that are kind of we do most often. So the first one, we were in project leadership, and then we went into this execution space. And we entered that space in and around 2014, 15, when we started to recognize, the world was changing quite a bit with regard to technology and regulation, and that organizations were coming to us saying, beyond just implementing and executing on our projects, it's harder and harder to actually deliver on our strategic objectives. And so 5 years ago, I started a study to really understand. So I'm a researcher here at Smith, And one of the things that I do is explore organizational challenges. And one of those opportunities really came to me through this program where I was asking the question, really, what gets in the way of driving these results? And it inspired me from, you'll notice even in the consulting space, a number of PwC, Deloitte, in this case, this Bridges Business Consultancy, are all kind of moving around. Even the Covey Group from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People are all kind of exploring opportunities of new ways of doing things that really allow us to drive out results in a very challenging, dynamic environment. And so a couple of things to share with you here before I jump into my own research was back in 2012, this Bridges Consultancy Group came up with this finding that 80% of leaders feel their company is good at crafting strategy, but only 44% are confident in their ability to implement it. And that resonated with Barry and I primarily because of this idea of this tendency for organizations to delegate the implementation of strategy down the organization. And so there was something we were intrigued by around that and how we get that, what people do on a day-to-day basis, how that aligns into the strategic objectives of the company to make sure that every investment in hour and dollar delivers on those strategic mandates. The second inspiration came from PwC. And this was interesting primarily because they made the reflection that only 40% of organizations are good at this, down from 90% 30 years ago, which suggests that something changed in the environment, which if you're older than, sort of 40, which I am and Barry is, we saw the days in the 80s and, and 90s when things seemed to be a bit more structured and the dynamics weren't so crazy. But when you bring in technology and advanced regulation and globalization, all of the environment changed quite a bit. And so this has really intrigued us to think about how is executing on the strategic objectives different today than maybe it was 30 years ago. So I'm going to present 4 results from my research, and then I'm going to turn it over to Barry. So the one thing that I just want to warn you about is that my 4 results, I actually am going to implement, get polls going so that we can get audience interaction. So everything I'm going to introduce, talk about what I found, and then I'm going to get you to tell me whether or not your organization aligns into that result. Okay, so the first one, and we'll wait on a second for the poll here for Shannon to help me out. So let me just talk a bit about what my finding was, and then we'll launch the poll. So, so just give me one sec here. Although the organization, so this is what I found, is that they do a good job of aligning incentives to employee roles. And so this was really a key part of execution back 30 years ago, was if you want people to do something, you get them, the management will assign an incentive. And what was interesting about what I found was that only 42% of workflows, or 42% of those, were not aligned to those incentives, which means that HR helps us define what our incentives are going to be and the behaviors that we're going to do. But then workflows are much more flexible and dynamic. And so there was a misalignment between the work we were doing and the way we were being incented. And then I found that only 23% agreed that their organizations take time to adjust the specific roles and responsibilities to meet the changing objectives. So the other thing that seems stuck is the definition of formalized roles and responsibilities. And then finally, 40% of respondents from my study said they were engaged by incentives, but 87% said they were actually motivated by the leadership making them feel more appreciated. And so this is an interesting outcome because it suggests A, that the incentives are misaligned with our workflows, B, our incentives are misaligned with the roles and responsibilities. And that's really where the poll question comes into play. So as a poll question, if you could answer, right, what percentage of the work you do is clearly rewarded by your formal incentives? Is it 20% of the work that you do? Is it sort of more like 35%? So you can go ahead and answer this to demonstrate again how much of the work you do on a day-to-day basis or a weekly basis is actually rewarded by your formal incentives. So once we get results from that, Shannon, you can share them with the group. Yeah, so this is very consistent with my study, is that, that very small percentage of what we actually do on a day-to-day basis is aligned into our incentives. And there's two things to take away from that. One is the opportunity to actually do a better job of aligning incentives. So that might be an HR opportunity. But the other thing is to also recognize that, incentives aren't the only motivator. Sometimes it just takes great leaders to walk around and really make people feel valued and appreciated. And that might actually drive out your outcomes better than, or even more effectively than, incentives. All right, excellent job. So the second one that I want to talk about, and so let me talk this through and then we'll go to the poll. So the second one was really finding the fact that senior leaders in the organization have very poor visibility on the work. So specifically, 68% of senior managers admit to asking their employees to take on too many additional responsibilities. We know this, Barry, this is kind of in Barry's wheelhouse, the fact that we have to do a better job prioritizing. But was interesting, we also found that only 22% of organizations agree their senior leaders invest sufficient time in what they call tactical planning. Now, tactical planning is an interesting concept because it's not operational planning, right? Operational planning is the how and the where. The tactical planning is a much more strategic way to think about the work. So if you think about a tactical force within a police environment, like it's a very strategic, thoughtful team that senses what's going on in the environment and actually knows what to do based on their own experience. So it's the tactical piece that is a real opportunity for leaders to think about. Am I a good tactical strategic leader? And so are you able to make trade-offs in terms of where people need to focus their time and energy? Like making a trade-off is a very senior leadership responsibility. It takes a lot of courage to be able to say, stop doing this and focus on that. Another example is tactical leaders organize work to identify interdependencies that can actually remove redundancies across organizational silos. So you can say, well, how are you doing that? How are they doing that? Maybe you're doing the same thing. Maybe we should do it this way. That's very different than operational planning. So the big takeaway here is to focus on and recognize tactical planning is not strategic planning, and it's not operational planning. It is that something in between. And so the next poll question, Shannon, if you can help me here, is how much effort does your senior leadership team invest in tactical planning? So I'll give you a few minutes just to answer that. We'll see what the results look like. All right, Shannon, you could probably share what you have. Okay, so we've got that 1%, those 3 people would be amazing to work in your organizations, right? To have senior leaders that are actually doing this kind of work. And it's very interesting. Maybe some of you can think about questions or offer things in the Q&A, because those 3 people are getting the feeling or getting the benefit of when senior leaders actually invest in, they do another 2-day offsite that talks about, okay, this is the strategy. Now let's spend 2 more days talking about the tactics to support that strategy. So I think we're all envious of those 3 people on the in the audience that are benefiting from that type of leadership. All right, the third one is called, this is fairly simple to understand, overuse of process. And I think this really does relate back to, organizations are fascinated by this idea that monitoring financial resources creates pressure to perform. We all know that, right? Cash drops, profitability drops, everybody panics, and there's a big pressure to perform. However, what's interesting about this is that seems to have bled into this whole idea that we can also manage organizational processes in a similar way by really proceduralizing them, right? Everybody's fascinated with automation and control to be able to get processes that go across organizational silos, but we're fascinated with process. And a lot of this came from kind of the lean work around Six Sigma work around quality management. And sometimes this works, right? However, the one thing that we need to recognize, and what I found in my study, is it actually reduces the pressure to perform. When you're automated and you have to hoop jump and processes aren't flexible, you sort of feel like you're just being kind of corralled through IKEA, as opposed to actually, being able to do your job. And so there's a very sort of a downside or a dark side to process-based execution. The other thing I found is that 67% of people agree that we actually waste valuable resources, because rather than getting people to work smart, we kind of get them to work in a very procedural way. And sometimes that can actually devalue people and get them thinking less about their job. So Shannon, if you could help me here, I want to know what percentage of your organizational workflows are over-processed. And while we're working on that poll, I'll just share this last bullet point here, which really one of the issues around process is the fact that another execution tool we use quite a bit is metrics. And metrics can also drive in a very procedural way of working. And it's important to also recognize this result that I found, which is 57% of organizations are reporting on the wrong metrics, right? So this gets right back into that tactical planning phase where we're like, I think this is, the metric but metrics can actually drive the wrong behaviors. And so we really want to be careful making sure that the metrics are actually driving the right behaviors. Perfect. So we'll share those results if you don't mind, Shannon. So we've got about the same thing where we've got, again, some people saying that organizational workflows are not over-processed, 0 to 20%. There's 53 of you. It could be in your case that actually, more process could be helpful. So again, we don't want to get rid of process. We just don't want to over-process. And for those people who don't have a lot of process, maybe it's because that's how it should be, or it could be that you actually need some more. So process isn't bad, but too much process can be challenging. All right. The last one for me before I turn over to Barry is called the culture of red. And so this is an interesting one. And so what I found was that 64% of organizations agree red on a corporate dashboard is interpreted as admission of poor performance. And so this is red, comes from the old dashboarding methodology. But what's really cool about my work was I found that 37% of organizations are actually using red as an opportunity for the organization to ask the leadership for help. And so I call this celebrating the reds, and it actually gives leaders the ability to gain visibility into where their attention and action can be dedicated in order to help solve problems and remove barriers. So my last question is, what is the culture of red at your organization? Is it an admission of poor performance? So it's this, common idea that we never want to report anything red because we know the culture that surrounds us will define that as we're failing at something. Or is it an opportunity to seek help? Or is it something else? Maybe there's some other thing that that I don't actually know about. And of course, if I get some people saying other, I would love for you to go into the Q&A and share that other, or even in the chat actually, to share what that other is. So as we get those, I think the whole takeaway here would be the opportunity to change culture. And so what I found is when I can actually go into an organization and change the execution culture from red meaning failure to red meaning celebration and asking for help, we actually move organizations from playing to win as opposed to playing not to lose, which can be a huge benefit in terms of improving execution culture. So Shannon, do you want to share the results there? So, oh, wow. So 87%. And again, those 34, if red means something else, please do inform me. I would love to know what red means in your organizations, but we definitely have 135 of you that are, this is an opportunity to actually change culture, is to flip the idea, the narrative on red as a celebration of people feeling psychologically safe to report that they're struggling with something. So my last slide here is just an overview of things that you can do. So 4 tips from me. So the first thing you can do is make people feel appreciated. It's actually essential to navigating the changing demands of business. The second thing is commit to expanding your strategic planning efforts to include execution planning, or what it was called tactical planning. Consider use of promise over process. So again, process is great, but sometimes you can just get people to say, hey, in my case, hey, Barry, would you help me with this? And he would say, hey, Kathryn, I'm happy to do that. Right. And he gives me his word. I know that's way better than process. And so this is where we start to examine other ways of doing things. Someone's word can go a long way. And then finally, the last one is play to win by celebrating the reds. And so as Barry comes off screen, I just want to thank all of you for your time with me. I'll come back on when Julia fields the Q&A, but it's been my pleasure and honor to share my research with you, and I'll pass it over to Barry.
Excellent. Thank you, Kathryn, and welcome everybody as I just get everything oriented myself. Really great to be here with you all, and you know, we had over 1,000 people sign up for this. We've got basically 400 live. I went through some of the names, and I want to say welcome to everybody, and also welcome back to a number of familiar faces within the group as well. So where I want to pick up is getting into that, what do we do about it? And Kathryn, you know, modestly left out that her research is really over the course of literally thousands of organizations. Now, so when you see yourselves as part of those statistics and data and where you fall into that research, you know, it really gives us an opportunity to say, okay, what are we going to do a little bit differently? And imagine we become that organization that's known as much for the product or service you provide as for your execution, your ability to get stuff done. Now, admittedly, this is a fairly new field. You know, those of us who've been around, call it the business space and the education space for some time, many of you will know people have been talking, teaching, working in the areas of strategy for literally decades. This is not a new field. And many of you practice the element of strategy very well, right? Fair. Leadership itself as a field is even older, and we can trace the origins of leadership study back to, you know, military doctrine, going back now centuries. So when Kathryn and I start to talk about the idea of execution and implementation and getting stuff done, this is really kind of the last 10 or 15 years, right? New, interesting, exciting, and as I said earlier, just a huge opportunity for us. So what is execution? Well, it's really the idea of bringing that vision and direction to life. It's that idea of execution, getting stuff done within our fields. And, you know, we've got a definition there on the screen as well when we talk about who owns it. And it's really at our level of these organizations as executives where we acknowledge not only do we have a responsibility to determine that direction, we've got a responsibility and an accountability to bring it to life. So that's what execution is. Why does it matter? Well, the adage I use is that your customers walked in your door today for a reason. They walked in the door of your organization to get stuff done. They're relying on your ability to execute. And in fact, if we're honest about it, your customers are buying your execution, your ability to get stuff done, and likely not much else. So that's the why. Now, when we look at this, as Kathryn alluded to just a moment ago, we've got a challenge quite often in areas of alignment and how we bring those aggregate resources together within our organizations. So I've got just a couple of things. It's a short webinar. So tactically, we want to leave you with a couple of ideas, some things that you can think about, not only the background and the research that led us to where we are, but what are a couple of things that I might be able to turn the dial on just a little bit over the next couple of days. Those three things that I want to focus on here briefly, I want to talk about aligning the work and aligning that work towards our vision and direction as a team, towards a customer. If we can do that, is even better. Aligning our people towards that work. And then finally, somebody's got to own it. And that element of accountability. And, you know, one of the things some of you have heard me say before is that nobody ever built a statue of a committee. And it feels like sometimes we're committed to death. But at the end of the day, I need to be able to look at somebody specific and say, yeah, they've got it. You've got it. And have them nod their head and say, yeah, I do. All right. So let's look into this just a little bit more deeply. One of the challenges we face often in aligning that work is what I call drive-by design. And this is where we believe sometimes that our domain ignorance is more important than, you know, the appropriate alignment of those resources. A couple of really quick examples. I was giving a keynote out in Calgary back in the fall, and, you know, I checked into my hotel ahead of time to get a bit of work done. Nice enough place. It had obviously been recently redesigned. And when I get to my room, here's kind of the setup. I'm going to get some work done. There's the chair that's in the room. And the chair is, call it typical for the rest of the design within the suite. And I look around and it's very nice. But the chair itself, that looks like something I might sit in if I was penning a note to the Prime Minister. Dear Right Honorable. So I sat down in the chair and it was about 6 inches too low for that desk. It was completely non-functional. A very nice chair. The designer of the room probably spent $300 or $400 on that chair, but it served absolutely no purpose. I call the front desk. I say, hey, I need a proper chair. You know, doesn't have to be a Herman Miller, but some kind of functional task chair. They couldn't help me. Incidentally, the GM for that property sent me a note a few months later saying, hey, we've replaced all the chairs in our rooms, Barry. But here we are. This one, just walking the dog through the neighborhood that my wife and I live in. This particular home is designed as having a 2-car garage, but obviously something went a little bit awry through that process. And you look at this and you say, there's no way you can put a second car in that garage. So the implementation, we're just doing stuff without actually thinking about the user, what the customer needs out of that particular process that we went through. All right, so these are just some of the challenges that we get into. So as we start to align the work, one of the common tools out there that I use is this operating plan, and you could use this. There's all kinds of tools. You can use an A3, you know, back in my manufacturing days, that's what Toyota did. You can use an X matrix, whatever tool or process you use, you've got something that takes that longer 3-year, 5-year strategy and strategic plan for the organization, and it distills it down into that next fiscal year. And this is what we've got here is that next 12 months, what are the key strategic initiatives that I need to deliver on if we want to move towards that particular vision that we've identified as a team? All right, now we talk about that 1-year fiscal portfolio of projects, some of the strategic objectives, you know, all of that sort of thing. I want to show you what this looks like here in just a minute, but down at the very bottom, a priority for me is making sure that I've got this plan approved with at least a couple of months left in the year. When we get to our second task here and aligning the people, I'm going to circle back to that. All right, so just keep an eye on. I'm basically saying that if you've got a January 1st fiscal year, I want to have this planning all wrapped up, approved, funded. The board has said, yeah, go by the end of October. For a lot of you in the room, you're going to say, you know what, that feels really early, Barry. What am I doing with that time? Well, we'll get to that in just a minute. Now, for a lot of us, you know, we'll define some of those projects. Imagine you had an organization, we'll call them Everest Mountain Equipment. And one of the key strategic initiatives we've got is this manufacturing readiness. We've got to be able to have the plant ready to launch this new product. And we're saying we want to have it done by the end of June. A lot of organizations do the top part here quite well. You know, what's the project? What's the, you know, description of the project? All right, good, let's get going on it. Kathryn talked a minute ago about this idea of tactical execution. And this is where we start to, again, align not only the work, but the resources. So I'm solving a couple of our problems here with one of the tools that we'll look at. And in this case, I want to make sure I've identified that sponsor. Who is the who? Who is the individual that owns it? And in this case, our VP operations, her budget is $1.8 million, and she needs to have this all wrapped up by the end of June. Now I've got it to the point where we can actually deliver on that. This is that level of information that a lot of organizations don't include, but it's part of our alignment process and making sure, again, that we've got the ability to hold somebody accountable at the very top associated with that project. Now, where this gets to be a bit of a living document, and again, you bringing this to life, is what do you do with it during the year? Well, for me, I put one of these projects per page, whether it's digital or, you know, on paper, it doesn't matter. But I have one of these projects per page. And then as we're kind of working through the plan during the year, we're taking notes. And me as perhaps the director of supply, during one of our follow-up meetings, somebody says, hey, what about the tooling? And okay, I'm going to follow up right after the meeting. And I come back and say, yeah, you know what, we've got that all taken care of. So this is where that becomes that live document. And again, a little more tactical than we use for traditional operating plans. And it helps us ensure that we're getting the stuff done that's necessary. All right, so are you taking that planning activity to this level and then using it again as that visibility and follow-up tool a little bit later on? Now, what happens after we've built the plan is quite often we don't communicate the plan. We don't sell the plan to the people actually doing the work. And you saw this in some of the statistics that Kathryn was talking about just a little bit earlier. And even, you know, myself, I was just in a meeting earlier this week, and, you know, the individual responsible for a large department had assumed that a lot of people just knew that their next task was to come back with a particular project proposal. You know what? One of the biggest challenges we've got with communication, obviously to Shaw's comment, is the illusion that it's actually happened. right? So let's find a way to formalize this. And I've got a bit of a poll of my own. And it's just a simple yes or no poll. The first question, and we can put this up on the screen, the planning process is well established within our organization. All right, what do you think? And this is that activity. Again, we've got that January 1st fiscal year that would happen. You'll kick it off in August. You'll go through, this is what we want to accomplish. You'll assign resources, build a budget around it. And hopefully by the end of October, we've got it all wrapped up. All right, so that's question number one. And that's the planning process. All right, what do we think here? Okay, interesting. We'll call it 50-50 for what we've got here. About half of us, yeah, we do a good job of that. And for others, maybe not so much. Excellent. So keep that in the back of your mind for a minute, and we'll move on to the second question. After we've built the plan, we do a good job communicating that plan within the organization. This is often that missing element. And, I'm rolling the dice here a little bit, but we'll see what the data shows to back that up. The challenge is that people can't do what they don't understand. And the people across your organization are those resources that are going to help you bring this to life. They're going to help you execute and implement that plan. So as part of our aligning the people, we've got to get out there. We've got to sell the plan. We've got to help them understand, why we're doing it, why now. And I'll show you some of these best practices as we go forward. If we've got that data, that's very representative based on previous iterations of this survey. Maybe 3/4 of us believe that our organization, after we've built that plan, we don't do a very good job getting to whatever's next with it. So have a look at this. This doesn't have to be complicated. For some of you, you've got a single facility entity. You can, shut the place down for a couple hours around 4:00 in the afternoon. We can go through this discussion. However you do it, whether you've got a slide deck, whether it's a little less formal, these are the key elements to bringing this to life successfully. This is what you're talking about. What are we doing? What are we doing as an organization? Why, and why does it matter now? Why are we so excited about this now? And you talk about what's going on perhaps in your environment or a technology you're capitalizing on. But the last element, and this is where you start to personalize it for people, you help them understand how it affects them. What does it mean to you and the way that you work? And when we can do that, that's when people start to say, okay, yeah, I get this, right? Start to nod their head. You can deal with any stragglers or people maybe not buying in at that point, but you are starting to align the resources in the direction that will help you get stuff done. And we could talk about why organizations aren't doing this, why we're not taking the time, but ultimately everybody's busy. But this is that simple thing, yet often, and as we saw 3/4 of us, such a common element that people are just overlooking. And I don't think it's intentional. I think just people feel like they're too busy for it, but plan on taking a bit of that time. So end of October, we've got the plan blessed. We're spending the next month, 2 months, whatever is necessary, depending on the size and scale of your organization, to make sure that we've aligned the resources, we've communicated and sold the plan, help people get a sense of the why. All right, so thank you for your input there. The last thing I've got here, and a good friend of mine, his name's Bill. Bill loves karaoke. And he says, you know what, Barry, it doesn't matter if it's Bruno Mars, Bob Seger, or Bon Jovi. When you're going to go up to the stage, you're going to sing some karaoke, you have to own it. And that's where people are going to be with you as part of the process. Well, when it comes to leadership inside of organizations, somebody has to own it as well, right? It's a matter of saying, those key projects and strategies, they have to have a sponsor level owner. I need to be able to look over and say, yeah, Barry's got it. Barry's nodding his head and saying, yeah, I do, right? We're going to make sure this comes to life. Those processes that Kathryn referred to earlier. Some people have heard me talk about Cross's Law. Most organizations either have a people problem or a process problem. Those dysfunctional processes are kryptonite for your company. Well, it's a matter of acknowledging that somebody owns that process as well. Even if it's across several departments, somebody has to own it. And that starts to make that process more functional. The last thing here is that any teams and committees that we are on, there is somebody with a single point of accountability. And Admiral Rickover's comment at the very bottom just echoes my philosophy from earlier, that nobody ever built a statue of a committee, unless you can actually look at somebody. You never had anyone in charge. Right? So who's going to own it? Simple things, and I've said this before, everything works in PowerPoint. but there's a few things that we can talk about as far as, what do I need to do tomorrow within my organization? Can I look at some of those key initiatives and say, yeah, right over there, I know who's got it. Right. Now you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, for some of the organizations in the room, yeah, you're doing just fine. So you look at some of the content of the talk and what we've looked at today, and you say, okay, so what? Well, think about it this way. Is your organization successful now because you are truly killing it? You have value you're creating, people get excited about your product or service, or are you doing well because of demographics? And this is something, even Michael Hammer pointed this out 20 years ago, but the population within North America has just grown substantially over the last 200 years. And even over the last 10 years, the population in North America has gone up by 25 million people, 1.25 million last year in Canada alone. So we're busier. There's more traffic walking up and down the streets, and that traffic is going into our enterprise, into our stores, into our service providers. So are you busy now, or are you successful because of the demographics and that increased traffic, or because you're killing it? And we want to be those organizations among this prevailing mediocrity out there that are saying, we want to succeed not only because of our good product or service, but because of our ability to get stuff done the way that we execute. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we'll turn it back to our hostess and open the floor for Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Barry and Kathryn. There's really, I think, a lot to dig into here from your presentations. So audience, just a reminder, if you have questions for Barry and Kathryn, please type them into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen so we don't miss them. There's a lot coming in. Off the top, I have a question, and I saw a number of people mentioning the workforce, the C-suite in the chat. Kathryn, who should ultimately be accountable for executing on the strategy?
The answer is simple, but it's just getting this person to do that is harder. But I think, so Barry and I will often talk about the CEO is actually the chief execution officer. When you think about who's actually ultimately responsible for driving results, if you don't drive results as the CEO, you are fired. That is ultimately what CEOs do. Now, the challenge is, I think, to get CEOs to recognize that execution is their mandate, because I think oftentimes CEOs think about strategy being their mandate. And I also think it's a difference between they're accountable, but they're not necessarily always responsible for doing that. So it's sort of a two-pronged answer. I think the ultimate accountability sits with the CEO. But I'm a big advocate for the CEO having somebody, like in government organizations, often the CAO would actually be the chief administrative officer that actually really does and makes sure that there is excellent tactical planning going on within the organization. And so I do think execution deserves to have its own C-suite person that would ultimately be responsible for delivering on those goals. It could also be the COO if it's a very operational company. So that's my answer. It'd be ultimately with the CEO, but I do think execution should be within the strategic portfolio of one of the other C-suite representatives.
That makes sense. Now, Barry, I've heard you speaking about productivity a lot lately here, elsewhere. Can you talk about the connection between productivity and execution?
Yeah, that's fair. And I'm glad people are talking about productivity. There's just such a huge opportunity. Everybody complains about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. We could say the same thing about productivity and the influence of it. Productivity, if you distill it down and you forget about the formal definition, it's really just the way that we work and how well we work at what we do. And organizations, think about your ability to say, serve 2 more customers. And I was giving a talk at a conference back in April, and right next to my hotel was this little mom and pop coffee shop. And wonderful little place, good people. The coffee was excellent, really nice aroma when you walked in. I joined a queue when I got in there, and I just paid attention to this kind of stuff, just the way that I'm wired. And as I was waiting for my beverage, for my coffee, 10 people arrived behind me, 5 stayed, 5 looked at the lineup, and then turned around again and left. So sure, a couple of those people might have bought a coffee somewhere else, but 3 of them might have gone to their office and said, I'll just fill up at the machine at work or whatever. But you look at the way that we work and the way that we serve customers in that particular environment. They're running a batch process. It was very inefficient. That's fine. I'm waiting for my coffee. But I look at those missed customers behind me and I say, well, if we're running a little more efficiently, then I would have had the ability to, bring a smile to 5 other customers' faces that day as part of our process. So think about the way that you work, and that's where we start to align productivity with execution in this example.
Yeah, that's great. Kathryn, what do companies that execute well do right? Are there common attributes to those firms?
So I was just having a chat with one of the people in the chat itself. I think one of those things for sure is recognizing that work that is similar gets cascaded down, objectives get cascaded down into silos. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I think that organizations do well that execute, I call it ventilating the silos. It's the idea, and my work is in healthcare transformation. So admittedly, the province of Ontario needs 1 remote patient monitoring program, not 14. And the problem is that oftentimes, because all these different pockets of money, people execute on something in different ways. And in organizations, that sits within the silos. So organizations that execute well are very good at working horizontally to recognize redundancies and getting rid of them. I think another one is that they are very good at really articulating what the outcomes are. So it's like, what are we trying to drive? What are the metrics? And really helping people align the work that they're doing into the metrics that you're trying to define. And then the third one I would say is they're very good at empowering people, right? So to Barry's point about alignment, like people have to feel valued. They have to see themselves in the work and they have to be valued. And if there's somebody not managing the people, right, in terms of just making sure that everybody's overworked, everybody's busy, it just seems to be the reality of everybody's, job right now. But if organizations don't know or treat people like they're replaceable, especially good people, they will leave. And I think that is one of the biggest execution, disasters, is when your good people are like, I don't want to work here anymore, so I'm going to dip. And so that creates a whole lot of challenge, I think, for organizations trying to execute on their objectives. So I could go on for more, but I think, Julia, you'll be happy I just stop at 3.
Yeah, no, and I think this is sort of an extension on that. Sunny is asking, how do you deal with the C-suite when they're oversimplifying the plans? So how do you get them to buy into the heavy lifting of execution work? Barry, I might ask you to start and then maybe turn it to Kathryn if you've got something to add.
Yeah, it's great. And Sony, good question. Good to see you. Good to have you with us. One of our responsibilities as whether you're a sponsor or somebody developing a project or presenting an idea, we've got to have the ability to sell that idea. Communicating up is as important as selling the plan and communicating across the organization. And it doesn't always seem to us like we should be responsible for making sure they understand, the plan. Shouldn't it be obvious? That's kind of what goes through our mind. It's rarely the case where they truly get it, and especially on that first pitch. So part of our planning process when we need to get the C-suite endorsement and support is, okay, what are they going to talk about? What are they going to ask? What do I need to say to make sure that they get what we're talking about so that we get the proper and appropriate resources and prioritization associated with this particular objective? So how you communicate and tell that story is one of the key things that I will always, help people understand as part of their responsibility, regardless of where you are in the organization. And telling that story is going to be, a very significant part of the process. Kathryn, what do you think?
Well, you're much kinder than me, Barry. I think for me, I'm always like, this is one of the hardest things. And I think actually, Julie, I think it's our fault. Our business schools don't teach enough about how strategic execution is. We're fascinated by strategy. We're fascinated by leadership. And it just kind of goes, and then you implement it. And implement what? So I think it's that whole idea. We have to, at some level, bring tactical planning up to the level of people understanding its association with productivity and driving results, which is why we're doing this webinar. But it's a very challenging message, because people at the top, leadership by nature is like, as I go more senior, I get more strategic, and I don't have to I delegate the tactics. But we can't delegate tactics as senior leaders, right? We don't have to micromanage, but we definitely have to recognize that there's tactical planning that is senior leaders' responsibility. And the person I want to actually answer this question is Brian Bates because he's talking to me about this right now. And he's like, he's got a director of strategy. So some of you on the call, please let us know, because it is one of those questions inquiring minds want to know, how do we get the C-suite to recognize execution is in their mandate, and it is a very strategic responsibility of the senior team.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a lot of great points there, and I can see that there's quite a bit of action in the chat as well. So as Kathryn said, please add your thoughts. It's really great to see that. This question is actually a bit of a departure. It's about AI. Does artificial intelligence have a role in execution and turning strategy into results? Kathryn, can I ask you to field that one?
Yes, but I'm highly biased about this, so then I have to get Barry to always filter my responses. So, I think there's lots that changes execution when it comes to how we do things. And it was in that quote that I gave, or that finding that PwC found in 2012, is that the world has changed, right? AI is just the new flavor, right? It's now everybody's talking about that. Before it was, e-commerce, and then it was, sort of analytics, and now it's AI. I think the reality is technology is getting smarter. It's getting more connected. It's getting more infused in everything that we do. So technology, I think, is changing the way we execute on our strategy. Automation, leveraging chatbots, all those kind of things are creating new and exciting ways of doing things. However, I would like to share a small story with you, because my mother bought a new oven. And this oven, she loved it because it had no knobs. It was the prettiest oven one ever did see. Now, the challenge is she cannot start the oven without using her phone. And so she is like, as soon as the oven came, it got installed. And now whenever she wants to cook anything, she has to email me or text me to say, can you turn on my oven? So I do think, Julie, this is a great question. Yes, I think AI is changing the way we do things, definitely creating opportunities. But it also has a huge dark side, right? In terms of it can get biased. It's not people. They don't have feelings. So the whole thing, and it can also, engineer things to the point that we forget how amazing people are. And, execution at the end of the day is about people and people doing work. If the AI is enabling people to be more informed and more efficient, I'm all in, right? But, at the end of the day, when organizations think about AI replacing, people, I think good, as long as people don't want to do that work, but you got to find new ways of doing things. So yes, I think it can drive costs down, but I really encourage people to work beyond the hype of AI and really recognize this is just a new way of working in the digital age. And quite frankly, when you get it right, people want to work with those AI enablers, right? Because it makes us smarter and more efficient. But it's a very thoughtful part of the digital transformation process.
Mm-hmm. Barry, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, briefly. Thank you, Julia. Kathryn's example of the oven. I'm rarely the smartest guy in the room, but when my appliances are smarter than I am, then I start to, I have my own bias that way too. But you know what, these devices, in our interactive, relationship that we've got with many of those devices now, we can turn on the heat pump at our cottage before we get there and it's cooled off nicely, whatever. That's great. A question my friend Ken Wong would ask is, what problem are we trying to solve? And I think any of our organizations, there's so much more applicable, applicability opportunity for AI than we really need. What's the challenge? What's the gap that we've got within, again, the way that we work, or that gap between strategy and getting stuff done that we want to solve? And if somebody within the organization can help us by applying some form of AI to do that, I think we're in a good place. If we can solve it ourselves, again, to Kathryn's point, we have a lot of really good people around the organization. Let's maybe have them look at this problem too. But again, what problem are we trying to solve?
Yeah, thank you. This question is about morale. So Barry, how do you keep frontline employees engaged when morale is already low?
Yeah, and I've been there. I've been in those organizations, and we say frontline. Frontline often has an unfavorable euphemism, meaning lower level, whatever. But to me, the frontline are the people that interact with our guests, our customers, our students, whoever they are, and that ability to get stuff done has got to be critical for them. So this gets back to our second tactic, in my portion of the program today, and the idea of aligning the people. And when I talk about rolling out that vision and direction, I'm not just talking within my leadership group. I want to make sure that everybody across the organization knows where we're going. They know why we're doing it, why now, as I said a little bit earlier, and just as importantly, how it affects them. And this is going to be a bit of a two-way discussion. And let's talk about some of the barriers they're facing and some of the other challenges they've got. But if we can't have that discussion, then I'm not doing anything to help that morale, nor am I equipping them, right, to perform their duties effectively as we start to change direction a little bit as an organization. So it gets back to, just an ongoing and repetitive communication to the point where, everybody's smiling and nodding and saying, yeah, I get it. I understand why we're going there. Thank you for including me.
Yeah. I'm just looking at the time. I think we have time for probably 2 more questions. So this question reads, my company is good at setting strategy and good at planning, but we commit to doing far too much. Kathryn, how can they keep a lid on it?
I might defer that to Barry. This is really Barry's mothership. So Barry, you want to start and then I can follow?
Sure. And that's such a common scenario. So please don't feel bad by, presenting that dilemma. So many organizations have far too many priorities. For me, in my next fiscal year, the next couple of fiscal years, the short answer is you should have no more than 3 or 4 key strategic initiatives. And then you've got to be able to say, of those 3 or 4 key initiatives in 2024, this is the one that I will not fail on. And there's a lot more behind that, but we all struggle with prioritization. We all, even as a bit of a badge of honor, we say, hey, I'm such a good multitasker, just keeping all those balls in the air. You know what? Let's get comfortable saying no. And if you can't say no, you can't manage. So sometimes we have to push back and say, no, I've got to focus on these 2 or 3 priorities right now. And that's going to make us all happier at the end of the year.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to actually ask both of you this question. What are some tools senior leaders can use to close the strategy execution gap? Who would like to go first?
I can kick that off. I started that actually, Julie. I must have anticipated that you said that. So I just put in the chat, there's a tool called 4DX. So it's called the 4 Disciplines of Execution. It's by the Covey Group. I put it in there to reinforce what Barry was talking about. They talk about WIGs, which are wildly important goals, and they recognize that it should be 2 or 3. That methodology is really good around prioritization. I'll also mention Hoshians. I'll put a link in there, but Hoshians are great for deployment planning. I find Hoshians are really good at tactical planning because they get more to the idea of, it's not operational planning, but it gets into the tactical. So I use a tool in there called the X Matrix quite a bit, and the A3s, and also a nice take on kind of a reporting dashboard. And then I think the last tool I would say really would come down to so it's an integrated approach to project planning. So many people look at integrated project planning could be one, but what this does is it looks for synergies across projects. So it basically looks for ways that when you're doing something over here, it can be reinforced. The other thing it does is it gets rid of all the redundancy, like all the things in an organization where the strategy comes down and silo A is going to do that this way and silo D is going to do it that way. And they recognize they're actually doing the same work to drive the same objective. So what this does, any integrated tool that gets you an integrated view of the work is really helpful in getting rid of redundancies. So those would be my top 3, and I'll put some links for people in the chat.
Yeah, that's great. Barry?
Yeah, such a great question to wrap things up. Some of you in the room may be of a vintage where you remember these things called Franklin planners back in the 90s. And a Franklin planner had a lot of stuff, had your contact information, your calendar, everything else, but we also had this to-do list. And this sounds goofy and simple, but one of the most effective personal tactics that we've got for execution and getting things done is just a to-do list. And we lost the ability to really have those lists when everybody migrated over to, you know, kind of these things. And, you know, there is a to-do list app on every one of our devices, but nobody uses it that way, right? On my own to-do list, you know, and I'm guilty as well, all I've got on there, are, you know, a wine that I saw in a restaurant one time that I really like, and I got to be able to find that at the LCBO or whatever. You know, it's stupid stuff like that, but the ability to prioritize your own time and work and keep track of what you've done does a lot of things. It helps you feel good about your day when you wrap it up. Hey, I've checked off these 3 or 4 things. And it also allows you to keep some of those larger organizational, departmental, even personal priorities in mind, and allow you to continue to focus your work and your activity towards that goal and objective. And you know what? We feel good about that kind of thing. So sometimes the simple and goofy tools are effective as well.
That's great. All right, I think we are almost out of time. I feel badly, there are a number of questions that have been submitted that we don't have time to get to, but we might be able to follow up with a bit of an article and try and get some of those audience questions answered in the future. I'll just note there's a number of links in the chat, books, some of the tools that Kathryn and Barry mentioned, so have a look at those as well. And before we wrap up, I'd like to remind everyone about the Queen's Executive Education Program that expands on what we've covered today. So Strategic Execution is a 4.5-day program here in Kingston. It's taking place from November 11th to 15th. And this is an immersive, all-inclusive program that takes a deep dive into strategy creation, decision-making, and strategy execution. So you can go to smithqueens.com/execed to learn more, and you can find details about the program under the Programs tab. We'll also include a link to the program in our follow-up email, which you'll receive this week, probably tomorrow, along with an on-demand version of today's conversation. Finally, I am happy to announce that summer is here, and this is the last webinar for our season. So we'll be back with a full slate of webinars for the fall in September. And in the meantime, if you're looking for more, we encourage you to visit Smith Business Insight at smithqueens.com/insight. There you'll find lots of useful articles, research, videos, and more. And you can subscribe to our newsletter there as well. That's it for us. Barry and Kathryn, thank you both so much for your fantastic insights today. And from Smith School of Business at Queen's University, thank you to everyone for tuning in. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.